Right, so last week we left off with a question, and the question was posed partly by Sharon and partly by Paul, and that was why our Levi friend was described as a na'ar, a youth, and then he was described as an ish, and then he gets described as a na'ar again, and then an ish again. I think Paul pointed that out right at the end of the shiur last week, and I said that that gave me a week to try and find something to explain that. One of the things that used to really annoy me when I was a kid was that I would ask questions and would be told by the teacher or the Rebbe, "I'll come back to you," and they never did, except for Rabbi Goldberg in Presswich, who always did. But those that didn't used to really get up my nose. So I have done my homework, and I will come back to you, and I am going to do that right now. So it's not unnoticed, it does not go unnoticed by some of the commentators that he is called a na'ar, a youth, and that he takes on a responsibility of an ish, of a man. In fact, if we have a look at verse 10, we have an interesting verse. Read verse 10 for us, will you please, Leon?
Micha said to him, "Stay with me and be a father and a priest for me. I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, a set of clothes, and your livelihood." So the Levite went in.
Right. So remember, at this point, I think he's only been called a na'ar, he's called a youth. And Micha is saying to him, "Come and be la'av, for a father." So he's appointing him to a senior position, to an av. He's saying to him, "Come and be a father figure and a priest." Priest is the senior person in the place, and the av, of course, the av bet din, is the senior dayan in the bet din. So what is it? What's going on here with a na'ar being appointed as an av? It seems to be a complete contradiction that a na'ar can be appointed as an av. Okay, so bearing in mind the scenario here, which is that Micha, and just by the way, for the record, this is not the same Micha as the prophet Micha, who we read in yesterday's Haftorah. The prophet Micha in yesterday's Haftorah is the last of the prophets, much later than this fellow. And of course, this fellow Micha was an idol worshipper. He was not a prophet. So it's a different fellow. Don't get them confused between the two Michas. So our Micha in this chapter is a fellow, remember, just a quick recap of the story, a fellow who took his mother's money, which he shouldn't have done. He then owned up to it, and his mother said, "Well, you can have it anyway because I have dedicated this money to Hashem." Micha then goes and gets an idol made out of silver, and he sets up this temple, this avodah zorah, this idol worshipper thing, and he makes an ephod, an apron, and he makes trafim. He makes these idols, which according to Rav Steinsaltz are human form type sort of idols, and he sets up this idol worshipper. And that's where we left it. And this Levi fellow, we're not told his name at the moment, this Levi who lives in Yehudah, in Beit Lechem, in the territory of Yehudah, wanders off north looking for something. He's searching in his life. Howard pointed that out last week, that he was on a journey of search, and he rocks up at Micha's place. And that's where we are. Micha says to him in this pasuk, "Come and be a father to me," even though he is a na'ar. So we find in a later pasuk in the Nevi'im, in the book of Yeshayahu, also known as Yeshaya, same idea as Michayahu, known as Micha. Yeshayahu is Isaiah. And we find in verse 3 of chapter 4, I shall now share my screen. Can you all see the screen? I hope you can see the screen. Yes, you can see the screen. Okay, yeah, you can see the screen. Good. Okay, have a look. Let's read this, Leon. Can you see my screen? Can you read it for us, or shall I read it?
Yes, I can read it.
Okay, read the first 4 short verses, please.
For behold, the Master, the Lord of hosts, removes from Jerusalem and from Judah a support and a stay, every support of bread and every support of water, hero and warrior, judge and prophet, and soothsayer and elder, captain of 50 and man of esteem, and counselor and skillful craftsman, and one who understands secrets. And I will appoint youths as their princes, and scorners shall rule over them.
Okay, so we have here this is a pasuk from Isaiah, who is prophesying about the destruction of Jerusalem later on, much later than where we are holding now. We're talking about probably, let's work it out. We are at the beginning of the period of the Judges, according to most commentators, although we're all at the end of the book. As I said to you last week, this episode of Micha is said to have taken place early on in the period of Shoftim. So let's say it was in the first 50 years. So it's 200 years of Shoftim. Then we've got the period of kings, of Shaul and David and Shlomo. That's probably about another 150 years, 350. Then along comes Yeshayahu after the breaking up of the kingdom. So we're looking at the Beit HaMikdash built by Shlomo, and then 400 years that stood. So we're looking at 5, 6, maybe more 100 years later, Yeshayahu, who is prophesying about the destruction of the temple, which is imminent. He says in verse 4, "V'natati ne'arim," I will place youths, sarehem, as their princes. So in other words, in this time of destruction, in this time where everything is going wrong, he set the scene in the first 3 psukim. Hashem says, I'm going to remove everything from Jerusalem. I'm going to remove my support. I'm going to be nowhere to be found. I'm going to remove myself from Jerusalem. It's going to be a bad time. And what will happen in a bad time? In a bad time, youths will be appointed as leaders. In other words, you'll have leaders who are not worthy of being leaders. They have no experience of leadership, and it will be a bad time. So when we read back here in our verse here, verse 10, and Micha said to him, come and live with me, and he translates it, my Chabad translation here is to be an instructor. It's not a good translation. The translation of the word Av is father. He's going to be a father and a priest. He's going to be a leader, even though he's a Na'ar. So the commentators point to the verse in Yeshayahu that this Na'ar was not fitting to be an Av and a Kohen. We certainly know he wasn't fitting to be a Kohen because he was a Levi, not a Kohen. But he was more fitting to be a Kohen than Micha's son, because Micha's son wasn't even a Levi. So the idea of this Na'ar and Ish interchanging seems to be a message to us that this is part of the period of time where the times are upside down. It's a time of anarchy. And we also had a question last week, if you remember, why verse 6 was where it is. Verse 6 says as follows, Leon.
In those days there was no king in Israel. A man would do whatever seemed proper in his eyes.
And we spoke about the way that referred us to the psukim in Sefer Dvarim, where we were told that people should not do what they want in terms of korbanot, at least. They had to do it in the place which Hashem would choose. And I asked the question why this verse was not the first verse to set the scene. And if I'm not mistaken, Howard wanted to say that it should be in verse 3. And in fact, the Mefarshim also pick up on this idea. And they say, no, actually, it fits quite nicely in where it is, because what it's saying is this. Verse 5 says this: now the man Micha had a house of idolatry, and he made an ephod and trafim, and he initiated one of his sons who became his priest. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his eyes, and as a result, there was nobody to make a fuss about it. Nobody complained. There was no hierarchy. There was no bet din that said, hey, Micha, you can't do that. So the Pasuk is in the right place according to this idea that although it would have fitted nicely to set the scene, and it also would have fitted nicely in verse 3, it also fits nicely in verse 6, because Micha has done the unspeakable. He's set up a house of idol worship, and he's made idols. He's made graven images, trafim. He's made molten images with this silver, and he's made this ephod, this thing that which is going to be used as some kind of a false god. And there was no king in Israel. There was no leadership. There was a complete lack of leadership. And this is what the two stories that we're dealing with in the end of Sefer Shoftim, the story of Pesel Micha, which is what we're in at the moment, and the next story of Pilegesh Begivah, the concubine in Givah, which is a horrible story of rape and murder. What those stories are telling us is that this was a lawless time of anarchy, where there was no king in Israel. There was a failure of leadership. Doesn't necessarily mean a king as in somebody who has the crown on his head, but it means there was a failure of leadership. And we've seen this. And that's why Shmuel Hanavi, who wrote Shoftim, placed these stories here after Shimshon, rather than chronologically where it belongs, where most people say it belongs immediately after Yehoshua, at the beginning of the period of Judges. But he puts it here as a bookend, so to speak, to tell us of the dire straits that the people had got themselves into. And all the while, the reason of explanation for that is because there was no leadership. There was a failure of leadership. And how often have we seen that in history, where both sides of the coin, a failure of leadership has led to disaster, and strong leadership has led to salvation. And we've seen that both in our own Jewish history and the history of the land of Israel. We've seen it in the history of many nations as well, that leadership is a vital element to prevent this kind of anarchy and terrible behavior going on. So the two questions that we were left with at the end of last week, we have now at least given some kind of answer to, and now I feel able to move on from where we left off. So let's go from verse 9, just so that we don't start in the middle of a bit.
Micha said to him, from where do you come? Excuse me. He said to him, I am a Levite from Bethlehem of Judah, and I am traveling to sojourn where I will find it suitable. Micha said to him, stay with me and be a father and a priest for me. I will give you 10 pieces of silver a year, a set of clothes, and your livelihood. So the Levites
Let's just stop there for a sec, Leon. Let's just stop there for a second. Why would Micha want this Levi, who's only a kid, to come and stay with him and to be a priest for his avodah zarah. He's already got a priest. He's got his son in the job. Why would he want to kick his son out of the job and give it to somebody else? Any offers? Yes, Hillary.
Because he's a Levite.
Because he's a Levite, okay. He's a Levite, correct. He's a Levite. So he thinks that, well, a Levi is one up from a Yisrael. He's not a proper Kohen, but at least he's from the tribe of the Kohanim. This is going to give my avodah zarah. This is going to give my temple some legitimacy, and that's why he wants him. Now, there's a perverse sort of logic here. And I think it's important to point this out because it demonstrates, I think, the state of mind of the people at that time. Remember, we said right at the beginning of this, when we were speaking about Micha's mother, she had this 1,100 pieces of silver, this enormous amount of money. Bearing in mind, this guy's just been offered 10 pieces of silver for his wages. That's a yearly wage, according to the commentators. So this is a lot of money. This 1,100 pieces of silver, and it gets stolen. And she says, verse 3, "Hikdashti et hakesef l'Hashem." I have dedicated this money to Hashem, and we spoke about this last week. That she had good intentions. She had this was for Hashem. This was not for an idol. This was for Hashem. Only it was all perverse. It was all upside down. Their thinking was all wrong. Instead of serving Hashem in the way that Hashem wanted them to serve it, they were serving Hashem in a completely perverse, twisted, crooked way by transgressing the fundamental commandment in the 10 commandments of not having idol worship. And you'll remember I spoke to you about the discussion I had 40 odd years ago with my cousin about celebrating Purim by having a disco on a Friday night, and I just couldn't understand that. And it's the same idea here. They wanted to serve Hashem, but they were doing it in an upside down way. So it's the same thing with Micha. He didn't have a Kohen handy, so he made his son into the priest. A Levi comes along and he thinks, oh, that's good. We'll have a Levi here. That will give me more legitimacy. But he wants to serve Hashem by having the correct priest. He wants a priest from the tribe of Levi, because the tribe of Levi are the ones who have been designated to be priests. So he wants to do the right thing. But what does he do? He installs him as a priest to a temple of Avodah Zarah. And one of the things that's important to note here is that the area that we're talking about is over here. Can you still see the screen, by the way? Yes, okay. Remember, the tribe of Dan is over here, Har Ephraim is over here, and Micha is in Har Ephraim. And Shiloh is where the Mishkan is. Now the Gemara in Sanhedrin, page 103, which we will get to in about 12 years' time at our current rate in the Sanhedrin Shir. At page 103, if you want to get a quick ahead of yourself by 12 years, you can look it up. Page 103b, it talks about about Micha. And I'll show you a little bit in a moment. But it said that Micha's temple was very close to Shiloh, very close indeed to the actual Mishkan. So much so that the smoke of the korbanot could be smelled in the two places. That's how close it was. That's what the Gemara tells us. And it tells us that to demonstrate that this was not somebody who was, up here in the top end of Asher, who in Sidon, right, who couldn't get to Shiloh to do his korbanot, and so he thought, you know what, I know I'm not really meant to do this, but I want to serve Hashem. I'll make myself a little place up here. And I'm not saying that that would have been right, but one could perhaps understand how that could occur. Micha's temple is right next to the Mishkan, a stone's throw from the Mishkan. He could very easily have gone to the Mishkan. He didn't want to go to the Mishkan. He wanted to set up his own place with his own idols, with his own priest. And that is an important thing to note. Whilst we're on Micha and whilst we're on that Gemara, let me see if I can show it to you. Okay, I don't know if that's possibly too small for you to read. Can you see? Can you see that? Is it too small, or can you actually see it? See if I can make it a bit. No, I can only make it that big. All right, so
we can pinch the screen bigger, Johnny. We can pinch the screen bigger.
Okay, if you can see it, this is the Gemara here. Sanhedrin, as you can see, page 103b. It's talking about all the people who are excluded from Olam Haba. These are people who are wicked people who have done such bad things that they do not have a portion in the world to come. All sorts of people, and we'll come to see who they are. There's this one person here who we're talking about, who you can see here. It says that he tattooed the name of a pagan deity on his male organ. And another opinion was that he tattooed the name of God on his male organ. So he was definitely out. Well, that's not talking about Micha, but that's the kind of person we're talking about. And then the Gemara asks a question. What about Micha? Why isn't Micha included in the group of people who are excluded from Olam Haba? After all, he set up a temple with an idol in it and had priests doing all sorts of stuff he shouldn't have been doing right next door to the Mishkan. Surely, says the Gemara, he should have been on the list of people out of Olam Haba. And look what the Gemara says. It's absolutely fascinating. You'll remember that last week I somewhat flippantly referred to Micha's house as a Chabad house, a stopping off place for wayfarers. And that was a little bit naughty of me, really, because I wasn't suggesting that the Chabad houses are houses of idol worship. I was suggesting that it was a house of hospitality, which, of course, the Chabad houses in out-of-the-way places are amazing at. But look what the Gemara says about Micha. Why was he not on the list of people kicked out of Olam Haba? Mipnei shepato mitzuya le'ovrei drachim, over here. It is because his bread was always available for wayfarers. Shene'emar kol ha'over v'shav el halavim, and it is stated, all who travelled to and from the Levites. Micha was very hospitable. He set up a Chabad house for any wayfarer that was passing, and he gave them sustenance, he looked after them, gave them food, gave them a place to stay. Notwithstanding the fact that he also had a house of idol worship, that fact that he gave hospitality saved him from being kicked out of Olam Haba, of being denied his reward in the world to come. So it just shows you, this Gemara tells us about Micha, it just shows you the power of hospitality that we have at our hands. People who help others out, who make sure that people have got somewhere to stay, somewhere to eat, and that they're not on their own and they're not feeling lonely and feeling neglected. That you can do all sorts of things in your life. You can be a real Rosha. You can be a Micha who does Avodah Zorah and all sorts of terrible things. But if you give hospitality to people, then you are not denied your Olam Haba. It's a very, very powerful message. And then the Gemara goes on to say some more things about Micha over here at the top of the page in the second column. And this is where it teaches us that Gerav to Shiloh, where Gerav was the place where Micha had his graven image, was a distance of only 3 mills. And as it says, as a result of this proximity, the smoke of the tabernacle fire and the smoke from the sacrifices offered to Micha's idol rose and intermingled. That's how close it was. So you can see that it was a very close place according to the Gemara, and it was a bad thing that Micha did, and yet he's not castigated out of Olam Haba because of his hospitality. And there's so many things to learn from this. That you can learn, number one, that do not judge a person on a single act. A person who does bad things is not necessarily a bad person. Somebody who does bad things and then does a good thing gets credit for the good things as well. We were always taught, it was a big thing when I was a young parent. I think it was fairly new in those days. You weren't allowed to say to a child, "You're a very naughty boy." You had to say, "That's a very naughty thing that you just did," because he's not a very naughty boy, because tomorrow he might be a very good boy. And you mustn't label somebody as a very naughty boy. You can tell them that what they did was a very naughty thing, and when they do something good, you can say that was a very good thing. So Micha, this Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us that yes, he did have a Chabad house, and he gets enormous credit for having that Chabad house. So,
something.
Yes, go ahead, Anita.
But yes, he was hospitable to the Levite, but he was leading him off the rails by appointing him to be noch a priest in his temple where he worshipped, where he was practicing Avodah Zorah. So that was a double whammy.
Well, you could look at it that way if you were looking at it with a negative eye. But looking at it with a positive eye, he did give lodging and food and comfort to these people. And presumably there were some people who did not get taken in by his Avodah Zorah and just benefited from his hospitality. And those that benefited from his hospitality, he got the reward for it. And you could also say, this is perhaps stretching it, I don't know, see what everybody thinks. You could also say that even though he may not have done this mitzvah of hachnasot orchim l'shem mitzvah, nevertheless he did it. And nevertheless, if you do a mitzvah which is not l'shem mitzvah, maybe you still get a reward for it as well. And we also have a concept that if you do something lo l'shem mitzvah, it can actually eventually turn out to be l'shem mitzvah. It didn't, as it so happens, as far as we know, with Micha. But nevertheless, he must have done something, because the Gemara is clear that he is not on the list of people whose Olam Haba is removed from them. So I think we have to give him credit for that, because the Gemara certainly gives him credit for it. But I certainly, you could certainly argue what you're saying is correct. If he did it and enticed them in to draw them off the derech,
Yeah.
The problem is, Anita, that there wasn't really anybody who was on the derech, because that was the norm by the looks of these things. There was no king in Israel who was objecting to it. He just got on with it. You don't see any hafganot, any what do you call it? What's a hafganah? Protests outside Micha's temple. So yes, Hilary.
You could also say that he was rewarded for the fact that he admitted to his mother that he stole the money and gave it back to her.
You could, but that's not what the Gemara says. The Gemara says he's rewarded for his hospitality.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I mean, admitting your faults is definitely something to be praised, for sure. Yes, Paul.
Because that's like teshuva.
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah,
Paul.
you just said in that Gemara, actually, that the proper sacrifices were also going on in Shiloh. So there were people doing the right thing at the time. Yes,
that's true. There were. The question is, were they sitting side by side? I think this is what the and we've seen this before. Remember, we've seen it before where you know, we had it with the Canaanim earlier on, where the Jews who were sacrificing to Hashem and also to Baal as well at the same time. They were hedging their bets. So yeah, I'm sure there was proper sacrifices going on, you're right, because you know, Shiloh still was going on, but there are other places in the Gemara that say Shiloh was, you know, was not such a busy place, and obviously there was bad things going on as well. The picture that's painted is one of general bad behavior, but for sure the Gemara does tell us that there were sacrifices going on in Shiloh as well. Yes, I fully accept that. Okay, so where have we come to from that? Oh yes, we went to the Gemara on Micha on that. So it's very interesting there that Micha is given his credit. So verse 10 says, "Come and stay with me," and verse 11, Leon.
The Levite desired to settle with the man, and the lad became to him like one of his own sons.
So here we've got. Hang on a sec there. We've got another paradox here. Micha says to him, "Come and be like a father." He says, "Come and be a father and a priest." And what does he end up being? He ends up being like one of his sons. Now, I don't know what that can tell you. He was employed to be a father, meaning to be the priest and the leader. I read into that, you know, if you want to be cynical about it, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And Micha was paying his wages, and therefore he was like one of his sons and not one of his fathers. The idea of a priest and a father and a leader is that you tell everybody else what to do. That's what the leader there for. You're meant to lead. But instead of becoming the leader, this Levite actually did whatever his paymaster wanted him to do. The Levite, as we will see later on, doesn't have any tremendous loyalty to Micha, as we'll see very shortly in the next verse, in the next chapter. But meanwhile, he's there, he's being paid, and he's like one of his sons. He's no longer like the father. He's not the father. Actually, Micha is pulling the strings here. That's how I understood that expression there. The paradox between being invited to a position of being a father and a leader and actually being one of his sons. Anybody who has been employed by a community as a rabbi may well recognize that scenario, and they can be employed as the leader, but actually they're not. I've never been employed, thank God, as a rabbi of a community. I hope never to be in that invidious position. But as you know, some of you know anyway, at least, my son is in that position, and in a previous position that he was in the rabbi of a community. I won't mention the name of the community, but they recently won the league, and he only had one run-in in the whole time he was there, which was pretty good, I think. But he only had one run-in, and I don't remember what it was about. I do remember what it was about, actually, but I'm not going to say because it might give away who it was all about. One of the community, not one of the executive community, one of the community was upset with him over something, and he had to explain certain things that he'd done that this particular person didn't like. And this woman said to him, "Don't think that you are the rabbi here. You are only an employee." And that was this idea here that Micha was pulling the strings here, and the guy that was invited to be the Av actually became the Ben. Okay, so verse 12.
Micha installed the Levite, and the lad became his priest and remained in Micha's house. Micha thought, "Now I know that Hashem will be good to me, for this Levite has become my priest."
Okay, that confirms what we said earlier on. That confirms that actually what Micha wanted was he wanted Hashem's approval. And this shows you this complete screwed up thinking that these people have got. Look at the words in the Hebrew. Vayomer Micha. Micha said, Ata, now, yadati, I know, Keyitiv Hashem li. Same as his mother. His mother wanted to do something for Hashem, not for Baal, and not for Dagon, and not for any other idol that you can think of the names of. They wanted to serve Hashem. She wanted to serve Hashem. That's why she made this thing out of silver, but the silversmith made. She thought she was doing the right thing. He thought he was doing the right thing. Poor Micha is living in such a shocking time. He's so uneducated. He's so messed up in the head that he thinks that Hashem is now going to be good to him because he's now doing the right thing. He recognized that he didn't have the right sort of priest before. His son was the priest, but he was only a sort of a B'di'eved priest because he wasn't from the tribe of Levi. Now he thinks, great, I've now employed a Levi from the right tribe, and aren't I a good servant of Hashem? Now Hashem will be good to me. I'm doing the right things. I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I'm serving Hashem by having a king, by having a Levi as my priest. It's all completely upside down because for us, it's obvious. We know that you don't serve Hashem by making a rival temple next to Shiloh. We know that you don't serve Hashem by having graven images. For us, it's like Aleph Beis, it's obvious. But clearly, it wasn't obvious for them. And this is the demonstration, and this is why Shmuel HaNavi, who wrote Sefer Shoftim, wrote it here and in this way to demonstrate to us the depths to which the people had sunk, not necessarily because they were rebellious. They weren't rebelling. They were just so lacking in leadership, lacking in teachers.
I'll be with you in 10 minutes.
In somebody to actually step up, like Shmuel, who's going to come along in the next book when we finish Shoftim, lacking in somebody like Shmuel who would come along and say, "Oi, this is not right. Let me teach you the right way." At this time, verse 6 applied. There was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in their eyes. It wasn't that they were deliberately doing it wrong, that they thought they were doing right. And how often have we seen that in history, where we think people think that they're doing the right thing, but actually it's completely perverse logic, and it's completely wrong. So that's the end of chapter 18, chapter 17, and we can now move on to the next part of the story of Pesel Micha. We've not finished with the idol of Micha yet. We've got another bit to the story yet, which is now going to come in the next chapter. Yes, Dave. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right, okay. If you're telling me that they were doing the right thing in Shiloh anyway, why was it necessary to set up other places if there was an existing place where the right thing was being done?
Okay, have you never heard of a scenario, I'm sure you have, of a scenario where somebody says, I don't like that shul, I'm going to have a breakaway. I have a breakaway shul. I don't like the way they do it in that shul. I don't like the nusach. I don't like the chazan. I don't like the rabbi. I don't like the fact that the mechitza's too thick or too thin. I don't like the tikkun leil shavuot. I don't like the way they haven't got this, that, or the other. So I'll make my own shul. And I think that's the way we are as a people. And I think that's what happened here. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Micha might have gone to Shiloh. I bet Micha did go to Shiloh. It was not very far away. Micha was obviously a religious man, and Mrs. Micha was obviously a religious woman because they were trying to please Hashem. I bet that they went to Shiloh and it didn't do anything for them. It wasn't their brand of Judaism. It was too from or not from enough or something that they didn't like. And so they set up their own. You're right, of course, Dave, and that's, of course, what we're trying to do in our shul. We're trying to make it so that people like coming to our shul and don't say, oh, I think I'll go off somewhere else because it suits me better there, because they do things differently, and I would prefer it that way. So I think that that's probably what happened, is that the people were not satisfied with what went on in Shiloh. It could well be that Micha himself, who was not a Kohen, wanted a greater role in the game, and decided that he would set up his own place. And we've all seen that many times. So I think that is possibly an explanation. Right. Any other questions or comments before we move on to chapter 18? Yes, Stanley.
Did you unmute me?
Yes, we can hear.
Okay. Question is, this is very interesting to look at the old historical situation in this period of time, because Jews were not united. They were living by the tribes separately. Each tribe was a separate government and separate, and they constantly were invaded by Philistines. And at this time, Philistines were a very powerful country and very advanced country compared to the Jews and to everybody. That's why all this situation, it's created this mismatch with all this. And except Shiloh, at that time, we had many sacrifices, many places for sacrifices. It's in Bethel and a lot more.
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. If we have a look over here, again at our map, we're going to learn what happens with a tribe from Dan. That's exactly what we're going to do in the next chapter right now. Stanley has set the scene very nicely there, because what we're going to see is that all these tribes here that you can see, remember, this is meant to have taken place shortly after the end of Yehoshua. Yehoshua basically failed in his overall mission of conquest of the entire land, and he was left. He said in his final speech to the tribes, right, go off now and do what you've got to do and take over your areas. You've all been given an area. Ephraim was given here, Binyamin was given here, Yehuda was given here, there's Bethlehem, Dan was given here, etc. Go and now and conquer your lands. And everybody went off, and it was all very tribal. And through the whole of Shoftim, we've seen that it was all very tribal. At best, we had 2 or 3 tribes that under a couple of the Shoftim, under Gidon, a couple of tribes. Remember, Ephraim twice said to Manasseh, why didn't you get me to join in? And they said, one of them said, well, you know, it didn't. You didn't even come when we asked you. And Devorah, in her song, castigates tribes for not joining in. It was very tribal, as Stanley has said. It was not a united Israel. We don't see a united Israel at all until the beginnings of it. We see in the rule of Shaul HaMelech. But it doesn't come to fruition properly until the rule of David HaMelech, some 100 and odd years after the time of Shimshon. So it's very tribal, as Stanley has said, and that sets the scene nicely for us to begin chapter 18. And look at the first verse of chapter 18. It's a verse that is familiar to us. Off you go, Leon.
In those days, there was no king in Israel. In those days, the tribe of the Danite was seeking a heritage in which to dwell, for an adequate heritage had not yet fallen to them up to that day among the tribes of Israel.
Okay, so here we have that familiar verse. There was no king in Israel, and the tribes of Dan were seeking an inheritance. Why were they seeking an inheritance? They knew what they had to do. They had to go to this area and conquer it. That was their job. The verse tells us there was no king in Israel. And the previous chapter on verse 6 had gone a little bit further and said, chapter 17, verse 6, had said exactly the same words. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his eyes. So when we go to our chapter here and we say there was no king in Israel, it is again telling us that this was a time when people were not doing what they should be doing. And this is a criticism. The fact that this is the introduction to this story of the tribe of Dan is a criticism of the tribe of Dan. It's saying Dan is not doing what it should be doing. And what it should have been doing was getting the nachala, the inheritance that it was given. Let me read to you the Steinsaltz translation. In those days, there was no king in Israel. There was no authoritative government, and people did as they pleased. This observation, which was already cited above, is repeated here to explain the ensuing events. And in those days, the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for it to settle, as up to that day, no inheritance had fallen to or been conquered by them among the tribes of Israel. So they were supposed to conquer here, and they hadn't done it. Now, maybe they weren't able to. Maybe they tried and failed, because look at where Dan is. Dan is in the area very close to the main places of Philistia, Plishtim. This is the area of the Plishtim. Remember, the area of the Plishtim is Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. They were the main cities. Look where Dan was meant to be. So it's possible that Dan has failed to conquer the area that they are meant to conquer, because the Plishtim are too strong for them. They're the neighbors and they're not allowing it. And I think that's what Stanley was referring to here. And what we'll see now is Dan's response. Yes, Leon?
Shouldn't we remember that this is out of order? And it refers back to chapter 19, where the boundary of it says the boundary of the children of Dan was not sufficient for them. So the children of Dan ascended and battled with Leshem and conquered it. So this really, correct me if I'm wrong, it happened before they were given they were ascribed the land which they were due to conquer. Or is that not so?
Not quite, because they were given the land they were meant to conquer by Hashem in Sefer Dvarim. Before they even went in. Yehoshua then repeated it at the end of his life and said, right, these are the bits. You have this bit, you have that bit, you have the other bit. So they knew which bit they had to have, but they hadn't done it. And it says over there that, there were too many of them. What's interesting is that other Meforshim say completely the opposite. That Dan, as you'll see here, is described as a mishpacha. And they say, some of the commentators say, that Dan had actually shrunk into a very small group of people, a small tribe, and weren't powerful enough to take the area that was meant to take. And so they then went to look for somewhere easier to conquer. And as we'll see in chapter 18, they picked on a very easy, soft target. Yes, Avril. We can't hear you.
She's just going.
Oh, she was going.
Waving.
Right, okay. Fine. Yes, Howard.
I ask you a very general question. Why is it that we tolerate English translations that are temporally wrong? The conjugations are not accurate. It says in the last, at the end of chapter 7, it says Vayoma Micha, that means Micha says. And then it says Yadati. And it's translated as now I know, but Yadati means I knew. I knew the Lord would do. It doesn't say I knew, it says I know. So it's wrong on both accounts, and it's all the way through. The Hebrew is in the present tense, which is quite dramatic, and it's always translated in the past tense. And I can't get my head around it. Why would we do that?
Okay. Vayoma Micha, and Micha said, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Leon translated that as Micha thought. Is that right, Leon, in your art scroll? Is that right?
This is verse...
The last verse, verse 13 of chapter 17.
Yeah, 13. Micha thought, correct.
Yeah, so I thought you'd said that. I didn't pick up on it, I just ignored it. But, you know, there's art scroll for you. It's not accurate, Howard, you're right. If you are seeking an accurate Hebrew translation, most of the translations will disappoint you, because what they try and do, and it's reasonable if that's what they want to do, is they want to get over to you the idea of what the Torah is trying to tell us, or what the Nach is trying to tell us, and they make it into a nicely sounding English. As an author, you'll appreciate that you know, you want to have nice language.
Except it can't be literal, it has to be more colloquial than literal.
But you are absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And as you will probably know, and those of you who have been with me from the beginning of our series of Shurim will know that I am a bit of a stickler for translations. I like it to be accurate. And I think that what Rosh Steinsaltz does in his brilliant translation is he manages to do both, because he gives us in bold the actual translation, and then in regular typeface he fills in the gaps as to what is going on there. So I happen to like that very much, and I think, but the point that you make is definitely an accurate point. But the explanation is that they're not really concentrating on the literal translation. They want to get over the point that they want to get over. Okay, let's move back to chapter 18 and see what the tribe of Dan got up to. Just a couple more minutes. We've run out of time really, but let's do another couple of minutes just to set the scene. So the Danites, who are in this area over here, verse 2.
The children of Dan sent 5 men from their families, from among their leaders, men of valor from Zorah and from Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to investigate it. They said to them, "Go, investigate the land." They arrived at Mount Ephraim, to the house of Micha, and spent the night there.
Okay, let's stop there. Let's stop there, because there's lots to stop and think about and talk about for next week. First of all, the things that I want you to think about for next week is, interestingly, they're sending out spies again, right, to spy out the land. Okay, so there's obvious parallels there. Let's think about the parallels between the spies that Dan is sending, the spies that Yoshua sent, and the spies that Moshe sent. I want you also to think about these places, Surah and Eshtaol. Where have we heard those places before? And we're going to see what happens when they come up to the Mount Ephraim, to Micha's house. They're going on the spying. Here's where Dan is. We've already said that Har Ephraim and Micha's house was very close to Shiloh, so it's over here. So they're on the way up north. And what are they going to be doing? Where are they going to go, etc. So there's lots of those things to think about for next week. Any questions before we call it a day for today? Before we move on, any questions? Yes, Stanley.
It's just a request question. You have a very nice map of this. Where did you get it?
I'll send a link.
Yes,
I'll send you a link. It's from Wikimedia. This is the whole map there. I've enlarged it so that because I was interested in this bit to show you, but the whole map's a very nice map actually. The 12 tribes of Israel, according to the book of Yoshua. This is where they were. I will put the link now on chat here. I will put it on chat. Type the message here to everyone. Here it is. You can now find that on chat.
Can you email it, Johnny?
I'll also email it. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
It's also in the back of the new edition of the Chumash, the ones that Nachum presented
the blue art scroll stone Chumash. Yes, that's correct, Leon. It's in the back of the new edition. There are Nachum and Nechama donated 4 or 5 of those to the shul there. Neville's showing it to us there on his screen. Not quite as colourful as this one, but it's in the back of that. So if you're in shul, you can have a look at that as well. But I'll send the link to that on WhatsApp as well. Any other comments before we stop? Okay, I will stop recording